Hey there, United States history students. What a beautiful fall day. What a beautiful fall day. I love the fall. I love the crisp air. I love sweater weather. I love it when the leaves turn colors and fall from the trees. So I got an idea for you. I have an idea for you. If you're sitting around wondering, wow, what can I do on this beautiful fall day? Here's an idea for you. Make some money. You could go out to your garage right now, and I bet you could find one of these in your garage. A rake. Get yourself a rake, go around your neighborhood, find those houses where there needs to be leaves raked up to the street and go to those houses and ask, hey, can I rake the leaves off your lawn? And you set your own price. And you could make, arguably, quite a bit of money today. You could do this. If you're thinking about this and you're like, yeah, actually that might be a good use of my time, then this lecture is for you. If you do something like this, then you are an entrepreneur. You're starting your own business. And the story of the late 19th century in American history is the story of three major entrepreneurs that completely transform American history. So that's what we'll be learning about today during this beautiful fall day. Hope you enjoy it. All right, hello there, United States history students. So this week we move back away from the Wild West. We head to the east and we stay mostly in the east for this particular unit as we begin our study of the industrial era, the late 19th century in United States history. Ever since the United States of America was founded in the late 18th century, we'd been growing and developing and growing and developing. We had been expanding westward, our population was growing. Economically, we were developing too. But in the late 19th century, guys, it's like somebody strapped a rocket booster to the American economy and we shot off. Our economy became one of the strongest in the entire world. We had cities that were growing exponentially, filled with factories and mass production. It was a very dynamic time. Things were changing, a lot of people moving from the farms into the cities. Women started going to work. Children started going to work. And when I say going to work, I mean going to work in a business, in an industry, in a factory or someplace like that. Children and women had always worked on farms in rural areas or in the homes. But now they're headed to businesses, industries, factories to work. It's also a time of immigration. So many men had died during the American Civil War, approximately 640,000 men that had died during the American Civil War, and that's a low estimate, depleted our workforce supply. And immigrants, we opened our doors to immigrants, and immigrants started flooding into the United States of America, into our cities, changing the demographic makeup of the United States of America and providing us with this new labor supply. And so we grew. So it was this amazing and dynamic time in American history. Famously, there's going to be a handful of entrepreneurs that are going to become some of the richest men in the history of the entire world. They acquired more money than you can even imagine. So much money that these men could literally control the United States of America. They certainly were able to control important elements of our government. And their story has two sides, both the exciting business aspect of what they were doing, how they were making their money. And then there's the other side, which is this growing disparity between the handful of super rich people in the United States of America and a large number of poor people living in poverty in these big cities. So it's this exciting dynamic time. It's happening at the exact same time that the West was being settled that we learned about in the previous lectures. So let's begin learning about it now. The very first term that you need to know about for this unit is the word capitalism. The word capitalism is a relatively new word. It was developed, it came around in the late 19th century at the same time that we're talking about. Prior to that, it was called laissez-faire economics. And I'm going to give you a very informal definition of capitalism or laissez-faire economics that, even though it's informal, I hope you find it helpful to understand this economic system. I call capitalism the economics of freedom. Capitalism is the economics of freedom. So let me take a moment to explain that. So let's take a moment here and rewind history all the way back to the 18th century, where the United States of America doesn't exist yet. We have in Europe monarchies, kings that rule over their people. They've divided up their land among the aristocratic class of people and then the commoners that work for that aristocratic class of people. The United States was part of that. We were not free people, or at least not entirely. We had a king. The King of England ruled over the American colonies. So way back then in the 18th century, they had a different type of economic system where the monarchy, the king, controlled all of the wealth. And that king could divide up land and wealth and distribute it as the king saw fit. The king could also tax as he saw fit. Now, as I say this is very much an oversimplification. There were parliaments and aristocratic privileges and other institutions that would try to control the economy of a particular country, depending upon which country we're talking about. But suffice it to say this. In the 18th century, when we start off, the government controlled the economy of a country. But then when the late 18th century comes along, and the ideas of the Enlightenment that we've talked about before, when we learned about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, when the ideas of the Enlightenment come along, and so many of these ideas are founded upon scrapping everything we've done in the past and let's create a new and better society for today. It was in that era that the idea of capitalism comes along. So capitalism is not originally called capitalism. It was called laissez-faire economics. And if you look at that word, laissez-faire, you might think, well, that doesn't look very English. In fact, you might be able to say it looks French. And that's because this economic idea started, or rather was born, in Paris, France, which was an important city during the 18th century, during the time of the Enlightenment, where philosophers got together and talked and exchanged ideas and tried to come up with a new, better way to structure society so that people could be more happy and more free. And some of those philosophers started to develop this idea that we today call capitalism, but back there they called a laissez-faire economic system. Okay. So let me first of all start off by defining some terms. When I say the word economy, the word economy essentially means wealth. So when we talk about a nation's economy, what we mean by that is how much wealth does a nation have? Now, it gets kind of murky when we try to define exactly what wealth is. Is it resources, money, other things that could determine wealth? I simply personally don't have the smarts to be able to give you all the specifics of everything that goes into what exactly wealth is. But hopefully you've at least got a general idea of what wealth is. I guess we could just simplify it and say, even though this is very much an oversimplification, how much money a country has. Economy equals wealth. So when I say an economic system is a system or a method by which wealth is acquired. So how do we make money? So in the 18th century, before the idea of capitalism came along, the economic system, which at the time was called the mercantilist system, it was based on the government owning all the money and distributing that money. So, and again, this is an oversimplification, I just want to make you aware of that, but for the most part, the government controlled the money supply. So then in Paris, France, you had these philosophers who got together to talk, and they wondered, what would it be like if we had an economic system that would go along with a political system in which everybody was absolutely free? In other words, you could go out there and you could try to make money however you wanted to make money. You could provide a good, like a product, something that you make, you could sell that, Or you could sell a service if you could do something. But you either provide a good or a service to people, and you name your own price. So you say, hey, I'll rake your yard for you this fall, and I'll do it for $50 because that's what I think it's worth. What would it be like if everybody had the opportunity to go and make money however they wanted to make money? And then oppositely, once you have your money, how will you then spend your money? What will you buy with your money? So you can make money however you want, you can spend money however you want. You're totally free in all of these things, and nobody can stop you from doing whatever it is that you want to do to acquire money or to spend money. Specifically, the government can't stop you from making money or spending money however it is you wanted to make or spend money. If everybody was let loose like this, what type of society would be created? So that's the fundamental idea of capitalism. So back then, it was called laissez-faire economics. So laissez-faire, if you speak a little bit of French, it means leave it to be, leave it to be. An easier way to translate it is a hands-off economic system. In other words, the government is hands-off. People can sell stuff, make stuff, buy stuff however they want, and the government simply does not get involved. That type of economic idea was radical back in the 18th century, just like complete political freedom was completely radical in the late 18th century. So when we declared our freedom in the year 1776 and we broke off to become our own country, the United States of America, we did create a society where people were politically free, or at least ideally people were politically free. Again, it wasn't all people, Native Americans, African Americans, women, but we began the process of creating a society where all people are politically free. So it makes sense that when we established a new economic system that would go along with this political freedom, it would be the laissez-faire economic system, where people were economically free as well. Okay, that was a lot there, US history students. I hope you followed along with it. I hope you've got a good fundamental idea of what laissez-faire economics or capitalism is. Again, I simply define it as the economics of freedom. Now, coincidentally, the exact same year that the United States of America presented its Declaration of Independence to Great Britain, there was, in Great Britain, a man who published a book that explained how capitalism worked. His name was Adam Smith. Adam Smith is remembered today as the father of capitalism, and his book, which was published in the year 1776, is called The Wealth of Nations. Again, just to repeat myself, Adam Smith would not have been familiar with the term capitalism. He would have called it the laissez-faire economic system. Okay, so a little bit here on Adam Smith. Adam Smith was originally from Scotland. And Scotland in the 18th century, in particular the city of Edinburgh, Scotland, was filled with a bunch of philosophers. And there was a whole movement called the Scottish Enlightenment that happened in Edinburgh, Scotland. But many of the great philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment, of which Adam Smith was one, the other great one was a guy by the name of David Hume, they decided to go down to Paris to meet the other great philosophers, the other great thinkers of the Enlightenment. So Adam Smith goes down to Paris, France, where he meets these philosophers who are talking about this new laissez-faire economic system. He absorbs a lot of those ideas and thinks about it himself. What would a society be like where everybody was free to buy, make, and sell whatever it is they wanted? And he came up with the fundamental principles of what such a society would look like. He wrote about these principles in his book, The Wealth of Nations, which is why Adam Smith, more than any of those other French philosophers, is remembered as the father of capitalism. He came up with terms that we still use to describe the American economy today. Okay, so in a society where everybody is free to buy, sell, make whatever it is they want, Adam Smith says that certain economic forces will emerge. And I have three words here that Adam Smith used to describe these economic forces. Okay, the first one is demand. A demand is what people want or need. So for example, people need food. It's something that absolutely all of us have a need for. We can't survive without food. So we're going to have to buy food unless we can make it for ourselves. So for example, there is a high demand for food. So that's an example of something we absolutely need, but then there are the things that we want. We don't necessarily need these things, but we sure want them. How about throughout history, entertainment? Most of us enjoy the pleasures of entertainment. Entertainment changes throughout history. Back in Adam Smith's day, that entertainment might be, going to the symphony, which was actually a fairly new thing in the late 18th century, but going to the symphony. You could survive without going to the symphony, but some people really enjoyed it. It was a want. Today, how about a streaming television service or whatever you call it, like Netflix? You can live without Netflix, but a lot of people want it. So that would be a want. So entertainment, food, these are demands that people have. So okay, if there are those demands that are out there, then if somebody wants to make money, they can make money by supplying a good or a service to satisfy that demand. So, people need food. All right. If you want to make money, you could start a restaurant or a grocery store, maybe a little farmer's market. If you know the demand is out there, and if you want to make money, what you have to figure out is what you can do to satisfy that demand that's out there. If you do that, you will make money. People will give you money for giving them food or entertainment or whatever it is that there is a demand for. So Adam Smith identified these two primary terms, which are sort of the foundation for a capitalist economy. There's a demand for something, and if there's a demand, then it will generate a business to supply that demand. So those are the two fundamental words, those are the two fundamental ideas of capitalism upon which everything else is built. The third word that I have on the screen is the market, which I don't really need for you to know too much for this. You can think of the market as simply the balance between supply and demand. So for example, automobiles would be a market in the United States of America. So how much demand is there for people to buy automobiles? How many automobiles do Americans need? What type of automobiles do they need? And then what's the supply? And does the supply match the demand? If too many cars are made for people, then the price of cars will go down. But we're getting into complicated economics there. Too complicated for this. We don't need to know the market as much as we need to know supply and demand. So going back to my original example of raking yards, when people have a yard full of leaves and they don't want those leaves in their yard, well, then that's a demand. And if they're not willing to rake their yard themselves, then they'll pay somebody else to do it. And whoever comes along with the service of raking the yard, if it's you or somebody else, well, that's the supply to meet the demand. And the big idea here is that government is not needed, that people will naturally express a demand, and people will also naturally supply that demand so that they can make money. Idealistically, capitalism is a win-win for everybody. So somebody's hungry, another person starts a restaurant, the hungry person pays the people who run the restaurant for food. The people at the restaurant who work hard to produce and deliver that food, they take the money. It's a win-win. Both sides are happy. Idealistically, capitalism makes everybody happy, assuming that supply and demand balance each other out. So again, going back to my original example of raking yards in the fall, do you remember what is the demand? Do you remember what is the supply? Now, if you think, well, the demand is People have leaves in their yards and they don't want these leaves in their yard anymore. That's the demand, and that's correct. And supply? Well, supply is the person who goes and rakes the leaves out of the yard. The market is how much they charge. So if you want to rake leaves from somebody's yard and you go up and say, hey, I'll rake leaves out of your yard and I'll do it for $500, and they slam the door in your face saying, get out of here, kid, I'm not paying you $500 to rake leaves, and you come back and you say, all right, how about 50? And they say, okay, that sounds much more reasonable. Well, then that's the market, or at least I guess it's part of the market of raking leaves. Okay, so let's have some fun with this. Let's have some fun with this. See if you can apply these terms. All right, so here's the situation. It is true that there are some people out there in the world today who have toothaches. Their teeth hurt, and these people don't want their teeth to hurt anymore. So there's a silly example, but it's true. So in this particular situation, what is the demand and what is the supply? You don't have to worry too much about the market here in this situation. People have toothaches out there. They don't want their teeth to hurt anymore. What's the demand? What is the supply? All right. So if you thought, okay, the demand is people want their mouths to be healthy and to feel good, you would be right. That's the demand. I labeled it here as oral health. So who's going to come along and help these people? Well, how about dentists? Dentists would be the supply. And so dentists help people who have toothaches and they make the toothache go away, and there is an exchange of money, and ideally everybody's happy. So I know I like having healthy teeth, so I pay my dentist. My dentist works hard for me to make sure that I've got healthy teeth. There's an exchange of cash, and everybody's happy. Now, I certainly don't like giving my money away, but I'm willing to do it for a good or a service that I either want or need. So I'm happy. All right, so here's another example. Out there in the world today, there are elderly people who, because of the aging process, can no longer take care of themselves like they once were able to. There are elderly people who need help with just basic daily living. Okay, in this particular situation, what is the demand? What is the supply? Okay, can you answer this question? All right, so how about this? Demand. Let's just simply identify it as elder care. What would the supply be? There's actually a sort of a wide variety of supplies for this particular demand. But how about assisted living communities? I have the word facilities up here. I don't really like that word facilities as I'm looking at it. How about assisted living communities? Like here in Upper Arlington, there's First Community Village, a fairly huge campus that provides elder care. Not just day-to-day living like, having food and physical assistance, but also provides, a social life. I know that First Community Village takes great care of elder people who need help or simply just looking for a nice place to live. All right, so once again, ideally, capitalism works. Everybody's happy. The elderly or the family of the elderly, they give money to the assisted living community. The workers and the management of this community take the money. People are always happy to take money, and people are willing to give money for a good or a service that they appreciate. So this is capitalism. Now, one of the things that you can think about as a teenager right now is, one thing you can think about is, well, what am I going to do with my life? How am I going to make money? Well, one way you can approach that is, what good or service could I happily provide? What would I enjoy providing for a particular demand? And so you might think of it like, well, you like computers, for example. Okay, what demand is out there that I might personally, as a job, enjoy supplying? Maybe I'd enjoy being a computer programmer. There's certainly a demand for computer programmers out there. There's a wide variety of tech support that is needed out there. Maybe I can somehow get into tech support. But that's one way in which you can think of your future in a capitalist economy. Okay, Adam Smith was actually a very controversial figure back in the late 18th century because traditionally people thought that you should do things out of selflessness. And this was rooted mostly in religion, that you should not pursue your own self-interest. That is being greedy. And Adam Smith, in his book, The Wealth of Nations, discusses how self-interest is not something that is inherently bad. So being, I don't know, greedy is a little bit of too much of an extreme word, but wanting to get wealthy, wanting to pursue wealth, wanting to make money, that's not a bad thing. Because if you want to make money, that means you're going to have to do something for other people that they're willing to pay you for. So if you right now want to get wealthy, and I'm going to fall back upon my example once again here, okay, grab a rake, go rake 100 yards in your neighborhood. You'll make a whole bunch of money, and you'll make a whole bunch of people happy because you just raked their yard. You provided a service that they wanted. So that's good for society. Adam Smith believes you pursuing your self-interest is good for society. So if I can actually quote Adam Smith here, this is what he says in The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith explains, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages." Okay. In other words, when we go to the grocery store or we go to a restaurant, we don't expect the people there to just give us food out of the kindness of their own heart. That's silly. We expect them to be interested in themselves. We understand that we need to pay for the food. We're not there to beg. We're there to give them money to make them happy so that they'll make us happy. That's a foundational principle of capitalism. Okay, so far into this lecture, I've been talking a lot about economic theory, which isn't necessarily the most exciting stuff that we're going to learn in this class, I don't think. But now that we've got that fundamental theoretical stuff down, now's when we can move into the more exciting stuff and we can get into late 19th century American history. But in order to do that, there's one more term that you need to learn. And that term is, once again, a big fancy French term because a lot of these ideas came from France during the 18th century. The term is entrepreneur. Entrepreneur. So I've got it plural here on this slide, entrepreneurs, but let me just talk about it here in the singular because I think it will be easier for me. An entrepreneur can be defined as an individual who independently develops and sells their own product or service. So in other words, here's a way to think of an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur isn't somebody who goes out there and gets a job by being hired by somebody. There's somebody who says, I'm going to make money on my own. I'm going to be my own boss. So if you go out there into your neighborhood with a rake, you are an entrepreneur. Adam Smith and most proponents of the capitalist economic system believe that entrepreneurs help to develop innovative things in a society. Entrepreneurs, in other words, move history forward. So in regards to entrepreneurs, there are essentially two different types of entrepreneurs that we'll talk about in United States history. The first are those entrepreneurs that provide a supply for a demand that already exists. So if you pick up your rake and you go around your neighborhood and you rake yards and you make money independently, that's an example of this. The demand is already there. People already want their leaves removed from their yards. So an example of an entrepreneur, a very famous entrepreneur that provided a supply for a demand that already existed is Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon. He is, for the most part, this type of entrepreneur. There were people who wanted stuff, books and other stuff delivered to their home. Now, Bezos was very innovative because he used the new technology of the internet in the 1990s to provide people with an online shopping experience, and that was very new and innovative. But for the most part, he's still just using a new piece of technology to provide a supply for a very old demand, people wanting stuff delivered to their homes. And of course, he was highly successful in doing this, and he's one of the richest people of all time now because of that. So there's an example of a very successful entrepreneur in American history. Then there are those entrepreneurs that are incredible visionaries because they essentially create a demand with a new supply. So there are the entrepreneurs that envision and create an entirely new market. So if you want to be one of these types of entrepreneurs, you have to be able to look at people and say, I know what you want, even though you don't know yet that you want it. And you can invent something new, and people think, oh my gosh, how did we ever live without this? And all of a sudden, everybody wants to buy whatever it is that you're making and selling. So as I give this description, can you think for yourself of a particular type of entrepreneur in American history who did this? Well, probably the most famous out of the entirety of the late 19th century, in the entirety of American history, it came around in the late 19th century, and that was Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison was an inventor who got the financial backing of a very important patron, a man by the name of J.P. Morgan. And Thomas Edison was first a visionary. He imagined certain new devices that people wanted, and he was a scientific genius and a very, very hard worker, and he spent a lot of time working hard to create these devices. Now, as a businessman, Thomas Edison could also be fairly ruthless, and we'll learn a little bit about that here in a little while. So his reputation isn't entirely untarnished, but he still is one of the greatest innovators that America has ever produced. He invented, for example, a phonograph that could record music and sound in general, and so Thomas Edison gave us recorded music. Probably most famously, he gave us the light bulb. Think of how recorded music and the light bulb completely transformed American life. Also, he invented the motion picture camera. Think about how recorded images, movies, television, how that completely transformed American culture. So look at what Thomas Edison gave us: recorded music, the electric light, films. There were probably very few people walking around the middle of the 19th century saying, hey, it would be really good if we could make movies. They wouldn't even know what movies were. They would understand stage productions, but movies, that they didn't even have any thought of that. But think of how addicted to video we are now. Think of what major industries have been created from films as well as recorded music and electric lights. Think about how your life is so dependent upon these things. So Thomas Edison is an individual who supplied a new product and therefore created the demand. So that was Thomas Edison. Now, as I gave this description of this type of entrepreneur as an innovator who could create a new thing that people would become completely dependent upon, probably for your generation, Thomas Edison isn't the first guy that you think of. You probably think of this guy, Steve Jobs. So when I was in high school, I don't think there was anybody walking around going, boy, I really wish I could carry my phone around with me in my pocket, and I wish this phone had in it a computer that would connect to something called the internet. When I was in high school, which was the late 80s, early 90s, this was a complete, we couldn't even conceive of something like this. It would have been so abstract and so bizarre to even think about it. But of course, at the same time I was in high school, Steve Jobs was already envisioning something like this and working to create the technology to make something like this possible. And of course he did. And now most of the people listening to this lecture are completely addicted and dependent upon having these devices on them at all times. So there are two examples of famous entrepreneurs in American history. And going all the way back to Adam Smith, Adam Smith said, this is what you get with capitalism, where everybody is empowered to make money however they want. There'll be some people who go out and do some really innovative things. They'll create things, they'll create new markets, and this will move society forward. We'll have progress, we'll have development. Life will get better. So this rather abstract economic idea of capitalism is an integral part of the American story. These ideas that Adam Smith wrote about way back in the late 18th century have a direct and concrete impact on how you live your life today. But the peak of the American capitalist system was in the late 19th century, when there were a handful of incredibly daring and talented entrepreneurs who created businesses that were among the most powerful businesses and the wealthiest businesses of all time, that they completely transformed America. But in this transformation of America into this industrial and economic superpower, there was also the creation of the inner city and of a large number of people living together in very squalid conditions and significant poverty. And there were so many people living in poverty in the late 19th century, by the time we get to the very end of the 19th century, at the dawn of the 20th century, that there were growing movements to provide economic reforms to the United States of America so that we could protect our democracy. All right, so when we get to the late 19th century and we have the emergence of these powerful entrepreneurs, they go by several names. I simply refer to them as the industrial titans. But these industrial titans, like this man that you see here, his name was Andrew Carnegie. Some people look upon them as capitalist heroes. They made the United States of America the economic and production superpower that it is. In the 19th century, the United States became economically very powerful. And in the 20th century, after these industrial titans had died, the mass production facilities that they helped to create then enabled us to win the First and Second World Wars. So many people can look upon these industrial titans as heroes. Other people look at them as these extraordinarily wealthy individuals that accumulated massive amounts of wealth, and in so doing created an American economy where there were literally millions of people living in poverty. That these were men without a heart, without a conscience. And so we have this particular term called the robber barons, people who didn't respect the industrial titans, who thought that they were just stealing the wealth of the country in their quest to create these mighty, powerful businesses. The people who look negatively upon these entrepreneurs, they call them robber barons. Now, which one is right? Well, that's for you to decide. Both of these perspectives contain elements of the truth. My job as your history teacher is to give you both sides of the story. And then, once you have the knowledge, you make the judgment call. All right. So when we talk about the industrial titans, there are three of the late 19th century that I will focus on. The first is John D. Rockefeller. You've probably heard of all three of these men. John D. Rockefeller is the first one. He's one of the wealthiest men in the entire history of humanity. He was worth $1.4 billion by the end of the 19th century. Today, that makes him worth nearly $400 billion. Can you imagine having $400 billion? I can't even conceive of that much money. So how did he make that money? Well, we'll learn about it in a minute. The second individual I will talk about is Andrew Carnegie. He was worth about $475 million at the end of the 19th century. That would be somewhere around $350 billion today. And then last but not least, there was J.P. Morgan, the famous financier. He was worth about $80 million in the late 19th century. He'd be worth around $1.2 billion today. Or to rephrase that $80 million back then is worth the equivalent of $1.2 billion today. All right, so as we start off the story of these industrial giants, let's put it in a context here. Back in the middle of the 19th century, there was really one industry that provided the first big, super powerful companies in American history, and that was the railroad industry. The railroads were big bucks. The railroad companies, you could think of those companies as sort of the Amazon.com businesses of the mid-19th century. In other words, the major super businesses of the middle of the 19th century. They were the railroads. Railroads were important for shipping, they were important for travel, but also they consumed a lot of resources, like timber, like iron, and eventually like steel. You also needed coal to run the locomotives. So what we find is that with all three of these industrialists that I'm going to talk about in the late 19th century, they all are in some way connected to the railroad industry. Okay, so let's begin our story of these wealthy industrialists finally with the story of probably the most famous and certainly the most wealthy of them all, John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller was born in the year 1839. He was born in upstate New York. That's also where he was raised. There's really a lot from John Rockefeller's childhood that helps us to explain his personality and his actions throughout his lifetime. He had several brothers and sisters, and he had a mom and he had a dad. His dad wasn't around a whole lot. He was therefore very, very close to his mom. And his mom was a stern, pious, religious woman. She instilled in her son the values of hard work, piety, living a life given to God, and this may sound strange as we talk about Rockefeller, not to be concerned with frivolous, worldly things. In other words, you don't need a lot of stuff in life to be happy. What you need is to be religious, to be devout to God. Now, that might sound strange, that those values are what the world's richest man are going to be instilled with as a boy, but as you start to understand his story, it actually all kind of works out. His dad was very different from his mom. His dad was a con artist. His nickname was Devil Bill. His real name was William Rockefeller. But Devil Bill was rarely around because he was too busy traveling around as what we called in the late 19th century a snake oil salesman. He literally went around from town to town to town selling this juice that he said could cure cancer. It was a complete hoax, but people desperate for a cure for cancer would buy this juice, and by the time they realized it didn't work, well, Devil Bill had simply moved on to the next town. He wasn't just a con artist in business, he was also a con artist in marriage. He had a completely different wife and another family away from John Rockefeller and his mom. So John Rockefeller's dad, not the greatest guy. And John Rockefeller pretty much spends his entire life being the antithesis of his dad. An excellent example from Rockefeller's childhood, which gives us an insight to his personality that will persist throughout his entire life, is what he would do with candy. Now, candy. We all like candy, and especially when we're children, right? And what do you do when you get candy? Well, think of what you would do as a young person the night of Halloween. You would gobble this stuff down by the handful. But here's what's interesting. Young John Rockefeller didn't. Whenever he would get candy, however he would get candy, maybe as a reward for something, he would rarely eat it. Instead, he would wrap it up, take it to school, and he would sell it. So even as a young boy in elementary school, he began saving a significant amount of money. So here we have those two elements of John D. Rockefeller, where you see sort of the pious religiosity of restraint and not being consumed by the luxuries of the world, depriving yourself of some of the luxuries of the world, like at a young age eating candy, and how this equates to saving and making money. And if you understand this from John D. Rockefeller as an elementary school kid, you pretty much have his whole life in terms of how he ran a business and made millions and then literally $1 billion within the course of his lifetime. And here's another interesting story from John Rockefeller's childhood. One day his dad came home from spending, weeks off on the road, selling his fake cure for cancer and sleeping with another woman. And he comes back and he talks to young John about his savings that he's accumulated. And he expresses pride in his son, saying, "Good job, you've been saving a lot of money." And young John, I'm sure like any son, was probably filled with a great deal of pride. I mean, doesn't every son love his dad's attention? But his dad asked to see this money. He's like, oh, where are you keeping your money? Okay, you're keeping it in there. Keep it safe in your desk or wherever John was keeping it. And after telling his dad where he kept his stash of money, where he kept his own personal savings, John Rockefeller went to bed that night. When he woke up the next day, his savings was gone. It had completely disappeared. Little John goes crying to his mom and dad. Somebody has stolen my money. And his dad tells him, yeah, I took your money. And John Rockefeller asks, can I have it back, Dad? His dad says, no. You were stupid enough to tell me where you hid your savings. Here's a lesson in life, son. You should trust no one, not even me. Who knows the impact, the emotional and psychological impact that an experience like that had on young John D. Rockefeller. But it certainly was enough to continue to push him in the opposite direction from his dad, to be more like his godly, caring, loving mom. She might have been lovely too, I don't know, but loving mom. And to say it again, John Rockefeller will spend the rest of his life being the opposite type of man that his dad was. So John Rockefeller was very religious, very pious, went to church with his mom quite a bit. It was a very important part of his life. And this self-discipline in lifestyle that he received from his church, that he should dedicate his life to God, that he should not be frivolous with his behavior, that expressed itself, interestingly, but probably not surprisingly, given who John D. Rockefeller became, in how this young boy started thinking about his own personal finances. Without any training, without any background in it, John D. Rockefeller, as an elementary school-aged boy, began accounting. He started making his own ledger books at home, and every week he would record in this ledger book the amount of money he made, either by his allowance or selling candy or what have you, however he made some money, the amount of money that he spent, and he listed specifically what he spent his money on, which is great for biographers because we get to see what young John D. Rockefeller was doing. His mom encouraged him always to give 10% to the church. So from the money that he made that week, he would also list exactly how much money he was giving to their church. And then he would record the amount of money saved each week, and he would tally it up and tally it up and tally it up. And as a young boy, he starts to become obsessed with that final number, the amount of money that I have, which is the equivalent to the amount of money that I have saved. And so saving money becomes a big deal for him, which means he doesn't want to spend money on anything unless it is a necessity. So young John D. Rockefeller, again, he's just an elementary school age boy, probably very different from most of the other boys of his time, and probably very different from most boys or girls of today. It's interesting, when he was a young boy and his teacher asked him, John, what do you want to be when you grew up? His response was, I want to make $100,000. He didn't say what he wanted to do. He didn't know what he wanted to do. He had no concept of what his profession was going to be. He just knew, I want to save $100,000. As a young man in his early 20s, John D. Rockefeller left upstate New York for Ohio, specifically Cleveland, Ohio. He had several different jobs, but didn't experience success in any of them until he got involved in the oil industry. So let's talk about oil. Oil is a black gooey substance that is a fossil fuel. It's the product of a petrified forest that is underground. This forest is millions and millions and millions and millions of years old. The trees became fossils. The fossils, however, becomes oil. I'm no scientist here. And there are particular spots on the earth where there are large oil reserves. And the first one was discovered in western Pennsylvania, which is pretty close to northeastern Ohio, in the year 1859. Now, as this black gooey substance is pumped out of the earth, the big question is, well, can we use it for anything? Is this gooey stuff worth anything? Can we do anything with it? And yes, there is something you can do with it. So the oil that is pumped out of the earth, that is called crude oil. That's the oil the way the earth made it. But if you take that crude oil and you do something called refining it, then it splits into two different substances. So you refine oil or you refine crude oil by simply baking it. You cook it at 350 degrees, and when you cook it, it separates into two different substances. One substance is called kerosene, which people know how to use in the middle of the 19th century. The other substance, and I'm not going to give a name for it yet, but maybe you can guess what it might be. The other substance is this really volatile substance. So when I mean volatile, I mean if you strike a match around it, kaboom, it explodes. So it's very, very dangerous. So people don't want to be around this other substance. So they literally, once they refine the oil and they get the kerosene, they take the other stuff and they dump it. They literally dump it into the earth. They pour it into streams. They pour it into rivers. They just want to make it go bye-bye. Okay, can you guess what that other substance is? Hint, it rhymes with kerosene. Okay, but nobody cares about that substance yet in the middle of the 19th century. They only care about kerosene. Why kerosene? Well, because in a day and age before the electric light bulb, if you wanted to have light at night, for example, you could use candles, but candles have a flickering flame. It's not a stable source of light. It can get blown out easily. Or you can use an oil lamp, and that's what kerosene was for. It was for oil lamps. You fill up the oil lamp with this kerosene. It's got a wick in it. You light the wick, and that wick glows slowly and steadily, and so you have a good source of light for the nighttime. Now, originally, before oil was discovered, the oil for oil lamps was actually made from whale blubber, and there was a whole whaling industry that had developed in the 18th century, the 1700s, gone well into the 19th century, but sadly, this whaling industry killed a lot of whales, and the price of whale blubber and whale oil went up. But there was a very large whaling industry that developed mostly out of Massachusetts in the United States. So kerosene comes along at the right time. This will help partially save the whale population in the oceans. But then what you have happen in western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio to a certain extent is an oil rush. The oil boom of the 1860s was even bigger than the gold rush to California in the year 1849. All you had to do was come to western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio, buy a plot of land, buy some farmland. You could farm the land, but you're also going to dig for gold, dig for oil. You're going to put a well in, try to pump out some oil. If you hit oil, you get rich. And so you had hundreds of people coming to this region, to western Pennsylvania, buying all these farms, drilling for oil, and several things happened because of this. First of all, because you had so many people who were drilling for oil and people striking oil at various times, the price of oil kept going up and down and up and down and up and down. And so the oil market was very unstable. And then along with this was the real estate market, which was also very unstable. Because if oil was found on property, that property became extraordinarily expensive. But then once all the oil was drained out of that property, well then sometimes the land became worth next to nothing. So for example, there was a plot of land around a new area in western Pennsylvania called Pit Hole, Pennsylvania. And this land, the oil was discovered underneath this land. And so that land was sold for $2 million in the year 1865. I mean, $2 million for a plot of land would be a pretty steep price for today. And that was in 1865 that land sold for. I don't know the acreage of this land, but I can only assume it was substantial. It sold for $2 million because there was oil underneath the surface. The land was bought, the oil was pumped out, and the land was sold in the year 1878, 13 years later, for $4.37. So you had this unstable oil market, you had this unstable real estate market, and then you had all these new little cities popping up throughout Pennsylvania. Oil City, Pennsylvania, Pit Hole, Pennsylvania. And just like the gold towns out in the West, like Leadville and Deadwood and all that, these cities were filled with mostly individual bachelor men who had traveled there to attempt to strike it rich. And so these towns ended up being these rowdy towns filled with saloons and alcoholics and all sorts of riffraff. And this was the oil boom of western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio in the 1860s. And into this industry comes John D. Rockefeller. So when Rockefeller goes into the oil business, in which he will make his millions, he says that every butcher, baker, and candlestick maker is in the oil business. For him, there was too much competition. For him, there was too much disorder. Later on in life, he will say, I brought order out of chaos in the oil business. So when he starts off, he doesn't really like pumping the oil out of the ground. He thinks, well, there's too many people involved in it. Where the money lies is in oil refining. So he starts his own refinery. Eventually, this will be called the Standard Oil Company. So Rockefeller, when he starts off, is buying the crude oil, shipping it into his refineries, refining that oil, packaging it into cans and barrels and stuff, and then shipping it off for sale. And when he started off, he was making money with Standard Oil, but just barely, because there was so much cost in buying the crude oil, having it shipped, paying for the packaging and the barrels and the cans and everything to put the oil in, and then shipping it off. All that cost money. He did make a profit, but it was a menial one, and he started thinking of ways to save cost. So let's stop here for a moment and think, what would you do if you were in Rockefeller's situation? The goal here is to make money, and you are making money, but just a little bit. How can you make more money? Again, you've got to buy the crude oil, you've got to ship that into your refinery, you refine the oil, you've got to pay for the packaging of the oil, so like the oil cans and the barrels and stuff, and then you have to pay to ship it out to stores where it's going to be sold. Where in that process can you cut costs? Okay, so here is Rockefeller's road to wealth. I've tried to summarize some of the basic things that Rockefeller did to start making his millions. And so the first thing he did was really trying to cut costs with actual production. So within the oil refinery, there's not much to cut in terms of the cost of actually refining the oil, but he started looking at packaging. So the oil was being placed into barrels. And here's a specific example. The men who were soldering the barrels together were soldering them in 40 different places. And Rockefeller was on the floor of the production, and he said, instead of soldering the barrel in 40 different places, try 38. And so they tried 38, and the barrel fell apart. He's like, all right, try 39. And they soldered the barrel in 49 different places, and the barrel stayed together. And Rockefeller said, aha, that's it. Okay, instead of soldering the barrel in 40 different places to keep it together, solder it together in 39 different places. And that cut cost with production. Later on, Rockefeller was bragging, we made so much money with that one simple act, but they didn't actually make money, they were saving money, which is, of course, for Rockefeller, the exact same thing. So the first thing that Rockefeller did was cut costs in production. The second thing that he did was something that people call eliminating the middleman. So instead of paying for the crude oil to be shipped from the wells to him, he simply made it part of his business. He had his own people go and get the crude oil and bring it to his refineries, thus reducing that cost of having to pay somebody else. And then lastly, and most excitingly, and most controversially, he wanted to reduce or eliminate competition. He wanted Standard Oil to be the only oil refinery. He wants Standard Oil to be the only refinery where the crude oil goes to, and the only oil that you're going to buy when you go to the market to buy kerosene. So how does he do this third thing? Well, the people who are interested in the business strategy of John D. Rockefeller, this is the stuff that they focus on, what he does. And what he does is very complex. I'll do my best to summarize it, but I will admit some of the things that Rockefeller does, I just simply don't know how he did it. But in general, one of the first things that he did, and I'll talk about two major things that he did. The first is he manipulated the railroads. So he needs the railroads to ship the goods. He either needs railroads to ship in the crude oil and especially to take his refined oil to market across the United States of America. Now, what John Rockefeller did once he started accumulating some wealth is he started buying the oil wells. So the oil wells would become part of Standard Oil. So he would not have to pay for any shipping from the wells to the refinery. He would own all of that. And to make it even easier, he made the oil wells and the refinery he put them on the exact same location to cut costs that way. But then the railroads. he started working out a deal with the railroads in these really interesting ways. And it was designed to eliminate the competition. So he's not really attacking the railroad businesses yet. But here's what he does. Try to follow along here. Let's say there's a train, and the train can carry 10 cars full of oil, and the shipment goes out once a day. Well, Rockefeller, let's say Standard Oil can only fill up 2 of those 10 cars. That means that Rockefeller's competitors are going to ask for the other 8 to ship their oil. So here's what Rockefeller does. He makes these backroom deals with the owners of the train companies. And he says, let me purchase all 10 of those cars. Now I'm only going to be able to fill up 2 of them, but let me purchase all 10 so that the only oil that you're shipping is Standard Oil. And whatever happens to seal this deal happens. Rockefeller gets all 10 cars, which means his competitors can't sell their oil. They can't have their oil shipped, which means they don't make any money, which means they start struggling financially. And it's now when John Rockefeller goes in for the kill with his competition. So he goes to their competitors and he says, let me buy you out. You've got your oil company, I've got my oil company, you're struggling, I'm doing just fine. Let me buy you out. Okay, so this is the second thing that John D. Rockefeller does. He engages in what his critics call predatory business practices. Predatory is a pretty negative word. Some people in business say, well, this is just business, it's competition. And at least in some cases, if not many cases, the goal of business is to reduce or eliminate your competition. And this is all John Rockefeller is doing. He's put his competitors in the situation where they really have no choice. They either submit to Rockefeller or they go out of business. But here's what Rockefeller does, and this is really interesting. When he goes to his competitors and he says, I would like to buy your business, he makes the business owners an offer. And the offer is a pretty sweet deal. He says, I will give you either a substantial amount of money for your business. So here's what your business is worth. Here's how much we've evaluated it to be, and we will buy it. And you will get the money. So you lose your business, but you get some money. Or he said, I will give you stock in our company, Standard Oil. So you will become a part owner of Standard Oil. You get stock. You become a part owner. This means you don't have to work. And as our company grows and becomes a multi-million-dollar company, you have a part in that company, which means you don't have to work again, and you will likely become extraordinarily rich. Now, if you were one of these owners of another company that John Rockefeller was driving out of business, how would you receive this? You're going to lose your company, and that's personally humiliating, but you're also told you're either going to get the cash value for your company, or probably even better, you're going to get a large amount of stock in Standard Oil so that you can just simply be a shareholder in Standard Oil and become, over time, most likely a millionaire. The Rockefeller family will brag later on in history that the patriarch of the family, John D. Rockefeller, destroyed your business but made you a millionaire in the process, which doesn't sound like a bad deal for most people. So this is what Rockefeller did to grow Standard Oil. And the more Standard Oil grew and absorbed more oil wells, more oil refineries, and the bigger Standard Oil became, the more he could cut costs. Now, something to think about here is if John Rockefeller bought your company, that was good for you if it was your company. But if you were one of the individuals maybe working in the refinery, chances are you're going to get laid off, and it might be a little bit more difficult for you to get another job with Standard Oil. And so there was this growing population of people being put out of work by John Rockefeller. These individuals had to go find a job elsewhere, and that was difficult for some people. I'm going to go back to the previous slide. John Rockefeller continued to manipulate the railroads, and this was actual, manipulation of the railroads. When Standard Oil got so big, then he could pit the different railroad companies against each other by saying, I am not going to ship on your railroad, I'm going to ship on another railroad unless you give me a rebate. So in other words, if I give you $10 a car to ship my oil, you're going to give me back $5 after that oil gets shipped. And if you don't give me that deal, well, then I'm going to go to another railroad company. So the railroad companies grew frustrated with John D. Rockefeller, and they'll try to strike back here in a second. I'll talk about that in a moment here. Okay, but let me just take a pause. Hopefully you are understanding how John D. Rockefeller operates a little bit. Again, I am no finance or business expert to give you all the details of Rockefeller's maneuvering with the oil companies and how he, or the railroad companies. But hopefully you're getting a sense of how John D. Rockefeller operates. So here is an important term associated with what John D. Rockefeller is doing. This term is called horizontal integration. Horizontal integration is what John D. Rockefeller did as he took over all of the other oil refineries and oil wells and oil companies. He is turning Standard Oil into the biggest, most powerful oil company in the United States of America, to the point that even though he was never the only single oil company in the United States of America, it sort of felt like it because his was the biggest and the most powerful, and Standard Oil was pretty much your one choice of oil to purchase at the store by the time you get to the late 19th century. So horizontal integration is when you purchase or one business takes over all the other businesses in that same industry. That's horizontal integration. Horizontal integration can be more commonly known as a monopoly. A monopoly is when one business controls the entire supply of a single product, and a monopoly is illegal, or at least it was made illegal in the year 1890 with a piece of legislation called the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act is named after John Sherman, a senator from Ohio. Yes, he is related to William Tecumseh Sherman. The two were brothers. Okay, so what's wrong with a monopoly? What's wrong with horizontal integration? Well, the fundamental idea is in capitalism, competition is good. So here's a silly example, right? So 3 popular coffee companies today, and you see these stores all around Columbus, Ohio today. You got Starbucks, you've got Tim Hortons, and you've got Dunkin' Donuts. Now the idea here is if you've got these 3 coffee stores, these 3 coffee companies, and they're all selling coffee, they all want your business, so they're going to compete with each other to provide the best product at the cheapest price. And that's good for you, the consumer. It's good to know that these 3 companies, they all want your business, so they're all going to say, hey, our coffee is the best and we can give it to you for the cheapest price. That's good, right? Because let's say if Starbucks takes over the other 2, well then Starbucks can go, ha ha ha, now we've got a monopoly on a market and we're no longer going to sell you our coffee for, $2 or whatever. We're going to sell a cup of coffee to you for $10 and there's nothing you can do about it because we control the market. So that's why the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed in the year 1890, was to say that a monopoly is illegal, and if a monopoly is created, then the government has the right to break that monopoly up. Okay, the railroad companies struck back at John D. Rockefeller by trying to unite and trying to dictate to him the particular price that it was going to cost to ship his oil. And in response, John Rockefeller thought, okay, if I want to bypass the railroads in terms of shipping my oil, how can I do it? And he found it more feasible to start building pipelines across the eastern part of the United States of America to ship his oil. So we'll go around the railroads. We don't have to pay them for anything anymore, or at least we have to pay fewer railroads to ship our oil. This is an example of something else. This is not horizontal integration where he's taking over all the other oil companies, but rather he's eliminating having to pay another person or another company for the production or the shipment or the sale of a good. So vertical integration is defined as all aspects of production and sales being under the control of the company. The goal is that you don't have to pay anybody for anything. Everything is done by your company. So for example, let me just stick with Starbucks here. Starbucks would vertically integrate if they bought the coffee farms in Central America where they hire their own employees to grow their own coffee beans. Then Starbucks buys their own airplanes to ship those coffee beans from Central America to Seattle or wherever the coffee beans are going to be roasted and then packaged. And then Starbucks buys its own trucks to ship their coffee across the United States of America, and then Starbucks has their own stores where the coffee is sold to you, the consumer. That's vertical integration. When you place all aspects of production and shipping and sales under the control of a single company. If you do that, you're not paying anybody for anything else, and so therefore you can save costs. Here's another more recent example that I've seen within the last couple of years. Amazon. So Amazon, it used to be when I ordered something at Amazon, let's say a few years ago in 2018, the package was delivered by some other shipping company like FedEx. But then, and for me personally, it was around the year 2019, I started seeing all these Amazon vans driving around town. And the deliveries were being made by Amazon employees. And everybody was like, aha, this is an example of vertical integration. Even if they didn't use that term. It's clear what Amazon's doing. They now no longer have to have a contract with FedEx or any other shipping company. Amazon's gotten so big that they can have their own shipping industry. And I'm sure this saves millions of dollars for Amazon. All right. Is vertical integration legal? Yes, it is very legal. But horizontal integration is the creation of a monopoly, and it is illegal. So two terms that are important to know. One represents a legal business practice, one represents an illegal business practice. All right. In the year 1879, Thomas Alva Edison invented the electric light bulb. Oh no! People don't want kerosene lamps anymore. People want to get electricity to their house and install their house with a new electric light, or install their house with new electric lights. John D Rockefeller's industry is threatened by the electric light bulb. So what can he do? Well, first of all, John D Rockefeller's got a little bit of time here. Time's working on his side because it's going to take a long period of time, several decades, for power stations to be constructed across the United States of America, for electrical wires to be spread across the United States of America, and for these lights and electricity as a whole to be installed in houses. It's really not going to be until the 1920s that we're going to have most houses in the United States of America with electricity. So that's 4 decades in between the development of the electric light bulb, the invention of the electric light bulb, and homes across the United States of America having electricity and having the electric light bulb in them. So John D. Rockefeller's at least got some time. And luck was on his side because there's another invention that's coming along that will help him out even more substantially and make him even richer. So as I was talking about the refining of oil earlier, and I said when you refine oil, you're essentially cooking it at 350 degrees, and the crude oil separates into kerosene and to some other volatile product that rhymes with kerosene. Hopefully you can guess that this was gasoline. It's really scary to think and sort of sad to think that gasoline was originally being poured into rivers and streams as a byproduct in the refining of oil. I mean, not only was this incredibly wasteful of a resource that's going to become incredibly valuable in the 20th century, but it was also terrible environmental pollution during a time when there were no laws to protect the environment. But now John D. Rockefeller and his refineries, Standard Oil, can simply start producing gasoline. The automobile, which is first invented by the Germans in the late 19th century, becomes sort of a toy for the rich. It really was not until the early 20th century that that Henry Ford comes along and has a vision of being able to mass produce cars using assembly line production, that cars can become cheap enough that an ordinary American family can purchase one. And then we'll have to have roads and gas stations and mechanics and all these other things that will completely transform American life and really, it'll transform the world. It was simply luck that Henry Ford came around in the early 20th century and began mass producing cars. By the way, this image here is not of Henry Ford. That's one of Henry Ford's cars, but that's just a guy playing around on one of them. So it was just luck. It was just luck. But oil is now going to be needed more than ever. More oil is going to be needed for cars, for boats, eventually for airplanes. Oil is going to become even more valuable in the 20th century, even at the early part of the 20th century, making John Rockefeller even richer. So what do you think of John Rockefeller so far? As a businessman, he's one of the most brilliant, successful businessmen of all time. He becomes one of the richest individuals in world history. Still today, he was the richest American who ever lived. Even the richest of Americans today, like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, still have not accumulated the wealth that Rockefeller had. But at the early part of the 20th century, for most Americans, John Rockefeller represented ruthlessness. He destroyed other companies. And there was a movement in the United States of America to take him down, and to take him down by legal means. Part of the fear of John D. Rockefeller comes from the fear of big business as a whole, and the development of big businesses as a whole in the late 19th century. They were new in American history at this point in time. I think we're familiar with them today. When you think about big companies like, Starbucks, Amazon, General Motors, Apple, Microsoft, whatever. We think about these big companies today, we're for the most part familiar with them. But in the late 19th century, they were very new, and American life as a whole was being transformed. Families were moving away from the farms and into the cities where people worked, in the factories. So there was the shift from farm to factory. And life in the cities, they weren't good. There was a lot of poverty, and there were all the social ills associated with the big cities: prostitution, alcoholism, gangs, drugs. All those things were already there in the late 19th century. And with more and more people working for these big companies, there was a sense that the people who were running these companies were really cruel individuals who had created this awful situation in America, that they were more wealthy or at least they were so wealthy they could control the United States government, and that the average American worker really didn't stand a chance to improve his own life. And so Rockefeller, being the richest of all the industrialists, he truly had a target on his back. Nobody did more to soil the reputation of John D. Rockefeller than this woman who grew up in Western Pennsylvania, Ida Tarbell. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about Ida Tarbell here because we'll learn more about her in a future unit on the progressives. But for this lecture, it's important to know that Ida Tarbell wrote a book called The History of Standard Oil. And in this book, she outlined, here's exactly how John Rockefeller took over businesses, displaced workers, and made his millions. Ida Tarbell, for what it's worth, grew up in Western Pennsylvania, and her dad lost his job to John Rockefeller, or at least to Standard Oil, when Standard Oil took over her dad's oil company, or rather, when Standard Oil took over the oil company that her dad worked for. But Ida Tarbell was a fantastic writer, and her book, which was published in episodes in a very popular magazine called McClure's Magazine, it really inspired people, and it really drew a lot of anger towards John D. Rockefeller, and it even influenced the federal government. The United States of America brought John D. Rockefeller to court on charges of violating the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Rockefeller was accused of creating a monopoly with Standard Oil. This court case happened in the year 1911, and the United States federal government won. The result was this: Standard Oil had to be broken up into various oil companies. It was broken up into 34 different oil companies in all. And Standard Oil was broken down pretty much geographically. So, for example, Standard Oil of New Jersey became the Esso Oil Company. Here in Ohio, it was broken down into Sohio and Marathon Oil. And in Indiana, it was broken down into Amoco. Standard Oil of New York was broken down into, or became the Mobil Oil Company. So Standard Oil is broken down into all these little companies. And Standard Oil itself is no more. Now, the irony of all this is, if this was intended to hurt Rockefeller financially, it failed miserably because all John Rockefeller did was become an investor in all these different companies. There's nothing to stop him from investing in these companies. There's nothing illegal about investing. So he invests in all of these little oil companies, and those investments grow, and he becomes even more wealthy as a result of this 1911 court case. So this sort of actually worked out for him. The Rockefeller name, back then and even still today, is associated with ruthless business practices. But for the people who know the Rockefeller story, there's a lot of people who really admire John Rockefeller for what he did with his money. Again, John D. Rockefeller was highly influenced by his mom and spent his entire life avoiding being the immoral, corrupt philanderer like his dad was. John D. Rockefeller made more money than anybody else in American history. He also gave more money away than anybody else in American history. The term associated with this is philanthropy. Philanthropy is quite simply charitable giving. Giving your money away to a good cause with the goal to improve humanity. You give your money away to make society better. And we see John D. Rockefeller very dedicated to this. And there are many examples of John D. Rockefeller's philanthropy. But here's one example that I find to be personally very interesting. There were two African American women who had a school in Atlanta, Georgia, for the education of black girls. This is the post-Reconstruction era. This is the late 19th, early 20th centuries. There are not a lot of opportunities, especially in education, for black girls in Georgia. So of these two women, one of them, her name was Sophia B. Packard. You see her pictured here. The other woman who helped start the school, her name was Harriet Giles. She's the one who's pictured there on the left. But it was Sophia B. Packard who went to John D. Rockefeller up in New York, and she told him about her vision for this school that they were creating for African American girls in the Deep South. John D. Rockefeller was so impressed with Packard's vision of the school that he gave her, and here I have to pause because I actually don't know how much he gave her, but he gave her a huge chunk of change to be able to found their school. And their school, Packard decided to name after John D. Rockefeller's wife. John Rockefeller's wife's maiden name was Spelman. And so Spelman College was founded in Atlanta, Georgia. This is a college that is traditionally for African American females. And so hopefully you're getting a very well-rounded sense of what John D. Rockefeller was like. Ruthless businessman, incredible philanthropist, extraordinarily religious, watched every penny. And so hopefully you can decide for yourself. Do you like John D. Rockefeller or do you not like John D. Rockefeller? You can hopefully, based upon this presentation, come up with a good judgment of this individual. Okay, so did John D. Rockefeller live humbly without any opulence in his life at all because of his religious Baptist upbringing? Well, no. Here's one of his homes that he built for his family on 3,000 square acres in New York. It's Pocantico. It's its own little estate, employed hundreds of its own employees. It's got its own golf course, as you probably might be able to tell from this picture. And this is where the Rockefeller family raised their children. They even bought for their children, or not bought rather, but built for their children here on the Pocantico estate, their own quote-unquote playhouse. A playhouse, which is likely bigger than the house that you're living in right now, and was filled with its own swimming pool, its own bowling alley, and its own indoor tennis court. And this is where these children grew up. So you probably think to yourself, as I think to myself, wow, these kids ended up probably spoiled brats. Just completely rich, filthy, spoiled brats who thought they were better than everybody else. Well, the amazing thing is, with the Rockefeller family, that wasn't the case at all. And in fact, the Rockefeller family is this incredible example of the richest family in America that was able to hold on to its wealth throughout multiple generations. And whereas wealth can really destroy some people's lives, I mean, there are the cases where people become extraordinarily rich and then their lives just go off the rails. They use their wealth very unwisely, and they themselves become very emotionally unstable. That doesn't happen at all with the Rockefeller family. And that's probably because the central values that John D. Rockefeller had were passed on to his children. You are to be a good person. You are to work hard. You are to save your money. You are always to save more than you spend. So in terms of how you handle an incredible amount of wealth, the Rockefeller story is one worth knowing. John Rockefeller and his wife, when they got married, they had several children, and the first three, I believe, were girls, and then he had a young boy, John Jr. And when John Jr. graduated from college, John D. Rockefeller started appointing John Jr. to be on the boards of several companies, so essentially to help run companies. John Jr. really didn't have any experience in running companies. He's a young man in his 20s. But for John D. Rockefeller, that was enough, because that's how old John D. Rockefeller was when he was first trying to start up Standard Oil. I think it also shows the incredible amount of trust and faith that John D. Rockefeller had in his son, John Jr. But John Jr. simply wasn't ready for it. And I don't think he enjoyed it. I don't think he had a natural propensity to run a business like his dad did. And being thrust into this situation, John Jr. had a nervous breakdown. And he deals with this emotional collapse by running away for a little while to Paris, France. He goes to France. He spends about a half a year living in France. And when he finally returns home, he drops off the boards of most of these businesses. He is going to continue to run a handful of them, but he has recognized his life's calling, which is philanthropy. The Roosevelt family will continue to generate a large amount of wealth through all the companies that they own. John Rockefeller Jr. makes it his life purpose to give away large amounts of money. One of the things that he personally saw value in was nature. And John Rockefeller Jr. plays a large role in the nature conservation effort. For example, he buys millions of acres in and around a town called Jackson Hole, Wyoming, to help create the Grand Teton National Park, which is right next to Yellowstone National Park. He also helps to create Redwood National Park, Acadia National Park, the Great Smoky National Park. He also helps to expand Yosemite. No single individual did more to help the National Park Service, aside from President Roosevelt, than John D. Rockefeller. We'll learn more about President Theodore Roosevelt and the National Park Service in a future lecture. Now, John D. Rockefeller Jr. had given up control over most of the companies. He just didn't feel like he was a good businessman, but he still was on the board of one particular company that had coal mines in Ludlow, Colorado. Coal mining was awful, dangerous work with a lot of health risks, death when a mine collapsed, or black lung from spending so much time down in the bowels of the earth breathing coal dust. This was a rough life, and the miners weren't getting paid well, and they were being worked too hard. Too many hours out of each day, too many days in a row. The miners in Ludlow, Colorado lived near the mines with their families, who they were trying to support. Then, in the year 1914, fed up with the horrible conditions and the low pay, the miners in Ludlow, Colorado organized and they went on strike. They simply wanted a livable wage and a 40-hour work week and the opportunity to have a labor union to represent their interests. The workers went on strike in 1914. It was April of 1914. And they were living in tents near the site of the mine. And one night, one of these tents burned down, killing a miner's family. And this led to all-out war between the miners and the managers of the mine. The National Guard was brought in. Because the mines were owned and operated by the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, and because the owner of that company was John D. Rockefeller Jr., John Rockefeller Jr. was held accountable for the massacre of the miners and the bloodshed that occurred between the miners and the National Guard. Now, we'll talk a little bit more in a future lecture about labor unions and strikes and the role that government played in these. But our focus here right now is the Rockefeller family. This was a company owned by John D. Rockefeller Jr. It was him and the other owners of the company that were profiting off of the hard work and labor of the miners. And when the miners rose up to strike so that they could have a livable wage, so that they could have a union, so that they could have a half-decent life for all that they're doing, and for all the money they're producing for the owners of the company, that the Rockefellers would be wealthy enough that they would be able to share. They would be able to meet these demands. And here's where we see the character of John D. Rockefeller Jr. When the strike negotiations were going on, John D. Rockefeller Jr. went to personally meet the miners. He wanted to be with them. He wanted to see where they lived. He wanted to see how they lived. He wanted to meet their families. This had not been done by any industrialist before in American history. So in the future, we'll talk about Andrew Carnegie and the Homestead Strike. We'll learn about George Pullman and the Pullman Strike. And never in those situations did the owners of the companies, the head honchos, actually go to meet the men who were on strike. And in this case, the men and their families who were striking. John Rockefeller Jr. met these men. He listened to their demands. And then John Rockefeller Jr. gave orders to the company to make the necessary improvements in the mining camps and in terms of pay and working hours so that the miners could have better lives. Now, he did not allow for the creation of a union, but he did go meet the men face to face. He spoke to them individually and as a group, and he made improvements. In response to this very bold and highly moral act, John D. Rockefeller Sr. gave John D. Rockefeller Jr. control over all of his companies. John Rockefeller Jr. was also responsible for, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, employing some 10,000 men to help construct Rockefeller Plaza in New York City. Even though John D. Rockefeller Jr. was never the businessman that his dad was, John D. Rockefeller Sr. was very proud with how John D. Rockefeller Jr. used the money and how he conducted himself. John D. Rockefeller Sr. died in the year 1937. He was 97 years old. He was the wealthiest man in American history and one of the wealthiest men who has ever lived, ever. And it's worth taking a moment to pause here and just evaluate him. What do you think of him? Was he a ruthless businessman? Was he an incredible philanthropist? Was he both? Do you like him? Do you hate him? What do you think of John D. Rockefeller? He certainly is one of the great American icons. All right. The second major industrialist of the late 19th century that we are learning about is Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was born and raised in Scotland as a young child. Very loving father and mother, but he didn't really have much respect for his dad because he saw his dad not able to keep up with the textile industry in which he was involved. He saw his dad as a guy who just sort of wanted to not be innovative, do things the way they'd always been done. And his dad suffered financially because he was willing to not keep up in the textile business. And so I think this probably had some influence on the young Carnegie, who would himself be very innovative in his life. So Andrew Carnegie made his money in steel. Rockefeller made his money in oil. Carnegie makes his money in steel. If I can continue on just a little bit with Andrew Carnegie's background, he immigrated from Scotland to the United States of America, his family looking for a better life. It's worth noting that when he was in Scotland, there was a powerful family in the region where Carnegie grew up named the Morrison family. And the Morrison family had for the community a library, but you had to pay to be a member of the library. You had to pay for, your library card. And Andrew Carnegie, he was so poor he couldn't afford this library card. And this really upset the young Andrew Carnegie, who felt that education should be an opportunity available to all, no matter how rich or poor you are. When the family immigrated to the United States of America, they moved to the Pittsburgh region of Pennsylvania. Young Andrew Carnegie got a job working as a telegraph operator. He was so smart that he could just listen to Morse code, the dots and dashes of the Morse code, the beep, 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 beep. He could hear that, and he was so smart that he did not have to write the code down and then interpret it. He could just simply hear it and know, okay, that's an A, that's a B, that's a C. He could listen to it and interpret it. Andrew Carnegie was clearly a very smart, very mathematical young man. He was truly a gifted businessman, even at a young age. He also had a very powerful personality. On the ship ride over from Scotland to the United States of America, he even charmed the ship's captain, who let him spend time with him on the captain's deck. So charming and smart, he really had what it took to be a good businessman at a relatively young age. So Andrew Carnegie is going to make his money in the steel industry. He starts off in the railroad industry. He had a mentor by the name of Tom Scott, who he loved dearly, and Tom Scott was actually driven out of business by none other than John D. Rockefeller. And Carnegie pledged to get even with Rockefeller and became his fierce competitor. But let's start with the steel industry. So steel had existed going back to ancient times, but steel was also very, very, very expensive to produce. So in the middle of the 19th century, really before Andrew Carnegie, things that were made out of steel were small things like silverware, jewelry. When we think about things that are made out of steel today, like bridges and buildings, those really did not exist before the age of Andrew Carnegie. It was Andrew Carnegie that was going to bring steel and mass steel production to the United States of America. He was going to develop it in the United States of America. So you go back in time to Andrew Carnegie's time and you saw bridges. Bridges looked like this. And they were made out of iron, which means they could only handle so much weight and they could only be so big. If you could travel to New York City in the year 1870, you would see a scene like this. You would not see tall buildings. You would not see tall skyscrapers. The tallest buildings would be 5 stories tall because these buildings would be built out of brick and timber. And if you build it taller than 5 stories, then there was a significant chance that that building would collapse in on itself, killing the people inside. That's not good, so you wouldn't build anything taller than 5 stories. Andrew Carnegie got his first big break to do something great in the year 1867. He was granted this opportunity from his boss, Tom Scott, although I don't know if Andrew Carnegie would have seen this as a big break at the time, or I think he saw it as an opportunity, but it was such a difficult task, and failure was such an option that at the time he probably saw it as daunting more than anything else. But it has to do with the railroad. So here's a map of the western United States of America at the time in the 1860s. The red lines on this map represent the railroad lines of the 1860s. So there's not a lot, but if you notice, the railroads in the west start with St. Louis. So if you can find St. Louis, Missouri here on the map, which would be on the eastern part of the map, the city of St. Louis, the gateway of the west, is also the gateway to the western railroads. So Andrew Carnegie's boss, Tom Scott, he has this idea. Let's link the railroads with the east to the railroads of the west. If we can link these railroads, then we can charge a fee to the railroads and we can make a whole bunch of money. But St. Louis is located on the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River is extraordinarily wide. The Mississippi River moves with a great deal of force, and you simply can't build a bridge from East St. Louis, Illinois to St. Louis, Missouri with the materials of the time. You couldn't build a bridge over the Mississippi using just iron and timber. The mighty Mississippi would just simply knock that bridge down and wash it downstream. Andrew Carnegie worked with this designer named James Eads, and they tried to work through various models of a type of bridge that could hold a train and go over the Mississippi River, and they just couldn't do it. Every model failed. Carnegie realized that if you're going to build a bridge over the Mississippi River to connect East St. Louis with St. Louis, you needed to have stronger material. And the strongest material in the world that they could think of was steel. The thing is, steel is so expensive, so costly to produce. You might as well just build a whole bridge out of gold rather than build it out of steel. But lucky for Andrew Carnegie, Carnegie went back to the British Isles, and in England he met a man by the name of Henry Bessemer. And Bessemer had developed a method for mass production of steel, which today is remembered as the Bessemer process. The Bessemer process can produce large quantities of steel at an affordable price if that steel is produced in large quantities. So the Bessemer process works by combining large amounts of iron and large amounts of carbon together, heated at 2,000 degrees, and then poured into frames, however you want to mold the steel. And this is how people began mass producing steel, or at least this is how this Henry Bessemer guy started mass producing steel. And Carnegie takes this method, brings it to the United States of America, and begins creating these huge steel mills outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There was a huge overhead cost that went into this. Andrew Carnegie had to borrow large amounts of money to begin opening these steel mills in Pittsburgh. He had to hire thousands of workers, and these workers are going to be doing very dangerous work in the steel mills. But he does it at large cost to himself. The bridge, which was named after the designer James Eads, was built. It took nearly 8 years to build it. It opened in the year 1874. There it was being constructed back in the probably early 1870s there. And it's still around today. There you see the Eads Bridge from the Illinois side of the Mississippi River looking into St. Louis, and there's the iconic St. Louis Arch. And so 1874 opens the age of steel. We can use steel to build bridges. We can use steel to build buildings that are taller than 5 stories high. We can replace the iron rails of railroad tracks with a far more reliable steel. And this steel is going to be mass produced in Carnegie steel mills in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is why Pittsburgh's professional football team is named the way that it is. And Pittsburgh becomes a boom town. Here is an image of the world's first skyscraper, as buildings that were taller than 5 stories tall were called. It was a whopping 10 stories tall. And of course, this began an age that would transform the United States of America, especially the cities. We are growing upward. We are building huge bridges, like the Brooklyn Bridge, a suspension bridge with steel cords. And the steel industry makes Andrew Carnegie one of the wealthiest men of his time and almost of all time. He never caught up to Rockefeller while he owned his steel industry, Carnegie Steel. By the way, I kind of go back and forth with how I pronounce his last name, Carnegie. So he was a Scottish immigrant. So and his name, as it was originally pronounced, was Carnegie. When I grew up, I always heard it Carnegie. And so I apologize. I bounce back and forth calling him Carnegie or Carnegie. You call him whatever you want. But however you call him, Carnegie was an interesting guy. Like John D. Rockefeller, he worked very, very hard, and he also had this religious bent to him. Carnegie is remembered for being really the philosopher of all of the industrialists. He was a thoughtful man. By most accounts, he was a very caring man. How much he cared for the men who worked in his factories, that's open to debate. But as one of the major industrialists of the late 19th century, he stands out because he wrote a book about the philosophy of wealth. This is an important book that you need to know. It is called The Gospel of Wealth. In this book, The Gospel of Wealth, which Andrew Carnegie wrote closer to the end of his career, it was published in the year 1889. In this book, he does 2 things. The first thing that he does is he provides a social philosophy. The second thing that he does is he provides instructions for what wealthy people should do with their money. Okay, so let's start with his social philosophy first. Andrew Carnegie has a particular idea about how society should be structured so that the country as a whole can be wealthy and powerful and constantly innovative. And that philosophy was identified at the time as social Darwinism. So let me just take a minute here to explain the philosophy of social Darwinism. So some of you might be familiar with the biologist Charles Darwin, who came up with a theory of evolution by means of natural selection. And that philosophy, or that theory, that scientific theory, was first published in Darwin's book On the Origin of Species in the year 1859. Now, Darwin came up with this theory about how new species evolve. And Darwin was writing as a biologist. He was a naturalist. He studied nature. He studied how animals interacted with each other, and plants too, and he studied nature, right? Charles Darwin did not study society. He did study human beings as biological creatures, but he didn't study social interactions. Charles Darwin was a scientist who studied nature. And part of Charles Darwin's original biological theory was that animals are competing with each other for resources such as food. Okay, so to summarize, Charles Darwin, he was a biologist, he was a scientist who studied animals, and specifically how animals evolve and how new species get created. And that a central part of his theory was an idea that animals are in a state of competition for resources that they need to survive, like food. Okay, that's Charles Darwin, the scientist. Now, it is important to know that Charles Darwin did not come up with the idea of social Darwinism. That was actually another man by the name of Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer liked Charles Darwin's scientific theory, and he thought he could apply that scientific theory of competition in the natural world to how human beings behave socially. And this Herbert Spencer guy came up with the philosophy of social Darwinism. So now, I need you to forget all that Charles Darwin stuff, because Charles Darwin did not come up with the philosophy of social Darwinism. The philosopher Herbert Spencer came up with this idea of social Darwinism. Hopefully that's not too confusing. So here is what Herbert Spencer thought. This is the philosophy of social Darwinism, and this is the philosophy that Andrew Carnegie embraced as true. That this is the best way to look at human society. Here we go. Social Darwinism is the idea that all people are free and all people are in a competition for a limited amount of resources, like money. Competition is the natural state of humanity. So when you go to school, there's competition. Only the top students will get an A. On the athletic field, there is competition. Only the best athletes will start on the varsity team. In the business world, there is competition. To use an example that I've already used in the past, in the coffee market, there is Tim Hortons and Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts, and they're all competing with each other to dominate the coffee market. In life, on so many levels, there is competition. I'm sure even in your social circles, there might be, to a certain extent, competition. Now, according to Herbert Spencer and Andrew Carnegie, competition is good. It brings out the best in people. At least that's how they saw it. Ideally, it brings out the best in people. So if you want to be the starter on your varsity soccer team, where you're going to have to work really hard, you're going to have to train. You're going to have to become physically fit. You're going to have to become smart. You're going to have to be the best on that team. And when you're striving to be your best, well, then there might be somebody else. They don't want you to get the starting position. They want the starting position, so it's going to drive them to work really hard and to be their best. And if we live in a society where everybody's striving to be their best, then that society will be an incredible society. Innovative things will be developed. New markets will emerge. People are working hard. The economy is going to do well. And those that rise to the top, those that become the leaders of business, Those that become the most prominent doctors and lawyers and teachers, or the top people in any industry, they are the best. Herbert Spencer coined the term the survival of the fittest. So, for example, if you start off playing football and you're at Northam Park in elementary school, playing on your first football team, you're one of thousands of kids around the United States of America who play football. Very, very few of those kids are going to make it into the NFL. Who makes it into the NFL? The best, the fittest. And those that don't make it into the NFL don't deserve to be in the NFL. Even though they may dream of playing in the NFL, they're not fit for the NFL. They are hopefully fit for another endeavor in life where they can experience some success. So that is the social philosophy of social Darwinism, and that's what was embraced in the first part of the Gospel of Wealth. Andrew Carnegie simply describing, here's what makes the best society, where everybody is free and everybody's competing with each other. Now, the philosophy of social Darwinism was embraced by the industrialists, guys like John Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and others who became extraordinarily wealthy. The flip side of social Darwinism is this. If you didn't make it, you're not one of the wealthier people. In fact, if you're living in poverty, it means you're unfit. It means it's nobody's fault but your own. It means that you didn't work hard enough. You simply didn't have the intelligence to figure society out, to know how to pull yourself out of the coal mines or out of the steel mills or out of working on the ground floor of an oil refinery. This is the United States of America. Opportunities are there. It's up to you to find those opportunities and to capitalize upon them. And so the philosophy of social Darwinism is easy to embrace if you're Andrew Carnegie or one of the wealthy, powerful people, because that's the life that you lived. Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller started with very little money in their own lives. Arguably, they came from poverty, and they, by their own smarts and their own ability and their own tenacity in business, they worked their way up. But what if you were a person who grew up in the same sort of environment? You went and you got a job. You worked really hard at your job, but you never got promoted. And because you want to have a family, you get married and you have children because that seems to be a natural thing to do. But the money that you're getting paid, you're not able to provide that much and your family's living hand to mouth. And then you get hurt on the job or you get really sick and you can't go into work anymore. Now your family has no money and you're destitute. How would you feel about this philosophy of social Darwinism? This philosophy which essentially tells you, you are unfit for society. So hopefully you can see how the philosophy of social Darwinism is a controversial philosophy, but it was also widely embraced by the industrialist, and really by a great many Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Here's an actual quote regarding social Darwinism from the Gospel of Wealth. So Andrew Carnegie writes, "Not evil, but good has come to the human race from the accumulation of wealth by those who have the ability and energy that produces it." So in other words, this first sentence here is a justification for the wealthy. That having super wealthy people in society like Carnegie, like Rockefeller, has produced good, not evil, for society. And then the next sentence really directly hits at or describes social Darwinism. He writes this: "Competition is best for the human race because it ensures the survival of the fittest in every development." So competition is good. All right, so that's the first half of the Gospel of Wealth, or at least the first part of the Gospel of Wealth. The second part of the Gospel of Wealth is what the wealthy should do with their money, which is, for Andrew Carnegie, as well as John D. Rockefeller, give it away. Philanthropy, philanthropy, philanthropy. Now that you've accumulated all this wealth through competition in society, and if you're one of the lucky ones to be the fittest, then it is your moral obligation to provide for society. And there is this religious overtone to it. Carnegie himself wasn't religious like Rockefeller was religious, but he did believe in God, and he did believe that he had a divine purpose, and that this was the same God-given purpose that all wealthy people should feel, according to Andrew Carnegie, and that is to take care of people, to use your wealth for good. And so you sort of get this religious feel from the title of this book alone, The Gospel of Wealth. In it, Andrew Carnegie wrote, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." In other words, you shouldn't die with money. You need to die poor. You need to give your money away. The man who dies rich dies disgraced. So how did Andrew Carnegie give his money away? Well, just like John D Rockefeller, he gave it away and to a wide variety of institutions. I can't possibly list them all, but there are a few big famous ones, and these institutions bear Andrew Carnegie's name, such as Carnegie Hall in New York City, one of the most famous performing arts venues in the United States of America. Making it to Carnegie Hall means, for most people, well, you've made it big. You've played Carnegie. There's also Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. No surprise why it's in Pittsburgh. It's the same town where Andrew Carnegie had all of his steel mills. The Mellon of Carnegie Mellon is named after another Andrew Mellon, who was the Secretary of the Treasury during the 1920s. We'll be learning a lot about Andrew Mellon when we talk about the 1920s. Andrew Mellon also did a lot to transform the United States of America. There's also, I don't have it here in the slideshow, but there's also an incredible art museum, the Carnegie Art Museum in Pittsburgh, still in Pittsburgh. It's an amazing collection of artwork from around the world that's there in the Carnegie Art Museum in Pittsburgh. I recommend going to it if ever you visit Pittsburgh. But here's the one thing that really represents Andrew Carnegie's philosophy of both social Darwinism and philanthropy. Remember, as a young boy, Andrew Carnegie wasn't allowed to go to his local library in Scotland because he was too poor to afford a library card. Well, guess what Andrew Carnegie is going to give to millions of Americans? Yes, libraries. Libraries that are free and open to the public. These libraries, like this one, were all built in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it is still not too difficult to go to a town, a big town like Columbus, Ohio, and find a Carnegie library, or even a small town across the United States of America. There were a lot of small towns that got their own Carnegie library. The main library of the Columbus Metropolitan Library System, which is located on Broad Street, or I'm sorry, it's not actually on Broad Street. It's close to the intersection of East Broad Street and Grant. That library is a Carnegie library. And of all the Carnegie libraries, it's one of the bigger ones. This image you see here is the stereotypical Carnegie library. Late 19th century neoclassical architecture. These sprouted up all over the country. In all, there were 1,687 libraries that were built across the United States of America. Andrew Carnegie gave $60 million for the construction and for all the books that would go into them. And then they were left for the municipal communities to run them. And these libraries really represent Andrew Carnegie's dream for what the United States of America should be. It represented his idea of the best type of society, where everybody is free, everybody has access to education, everybody has the opportunity to go to a library, to read, to learn, to improve themselves, so that if you want to make it big, you have the opportunity to make it big. This idea of the American dream, of America being the land of opportunity, this was fully embraced and promoted by and lived by Andrew Carnegie. And Andrew Carnegie really was a man of principle and a man of his word. You know, for social Darwinism to really work, everybody's got to start off on equal footing, right? I mean, if you have some kids that start off and their parents give them, $1 million at the get-go, and you have other kids being raised in poverty, well, that's not really a fair and equal start. It's not really going to be survival of the fittest, right? It's going to be survival of whoever's parents have the most money and protect them. And Andrew Carnegie recognized this, which is why when Andrew Carnegie died, he did not, like John D. Rockefeller, leave his children with millions of dollars. He did leave his children homes so that they could live comfortably and a small amount of money. But in the end, his children, they ended up having to sell their homes because they didn't make enough money to keep up the payments for the homes. And they were on their own. So Andrew Carnegie really, he did give all of his money away. I don't know exactly how his children felt about this, but Andrew Carnegie, man of principle. You know, when it comes to the Rockefellers, Rockefeller's family is still around and still very wealthy today. But the descendants of Andrew Carnegie, well, who knows where they are. This philosophy of social Darwinism was best expressed in popular novels at the time written by a man named Horatio Alger. Horatio Alger made his own small fortune as an author, writing books about rags to riches, stories of boys who start off in poverty. Then, through their own hard work, through their tenacity, through their ability to see an opportunity and to jump on it, to not let luck pass you by, but to capitalize upon opportunities and to rise up, making something of yourself, running a business, accumulating some wealth, and then using that wealth wisely and philanthropically. Those were the rags to riches novels of Horatio Alger. Novels like Luck and Pluck, novels like Tattered Tom. These were best-selling novels of the late 19th century that seemed to reflect the real-life stories of Andrew Carnegie and John D Rockefeller, working their way up from nothing into something into extraordinarily powerful men. So both Rockefeller and Carnegie led these Horatio Alger-like lives. They were rags to riches. Here's our last of the three industrialists of the late 19th century who did not start off in rags. J.P. Morgan. He made his money in finance. He was born into a very wealthy family. During his childhood, he traveled around the United States and Europe and was educated in a university in Germany. He was a quiet kid, not very social at all, sort of socially very awkward. He spent a lot of time as a kid in art galleries and going to concerts, and that would sort of influence him in his later life too. So he starts off very different from Rockefeller and Carnegie. He starts off from a family of wealth. And he also makes his money in finance. And that's a little bit harder for us to understand because oil, steel, those are very concrete things. Running a business where you make things and sell things, that's very concrete. Finance is a little bit more abstract. Running a bank and how you use money, that's a little bit more abstract. A little bit harder for us to understand how J.P. Morgan made his money. But I will do my best to explain it to you guys. First, of the money he was born into, he used some of that money to help finance the inventions of Thomas Edison. It was J.P. Morgan who was the money behind the electric light bulb, or the invention of the electric light bulb. J.P. Morgan's house in New York City was it was the first house to have electricity and electric lights. Now it's here where we start to see a fault in the mind of Thomas Edison. It's one of the most controversial things that Thomas Edison did. So Thomas Edison was powering his electric lights and J.P. Morgan's home with something called direct current. Direct current was a powerful electrical current, but it couldn't go very far. So if you wanted to have a whole city powered by direct current, you're going to have a lot of power plants around the city. Thomas Edison had a former employee who worked at his research lab at Menlo Park in New Jersey named Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla was a brilliant Serbian immigrant who helped to develop something called alternating current, or AC. And this alternating current could keep its strength over long distances. So in the 1880s, an event happened that we call today the War of the Currents. Nikola Tesla quit working for Edison, and just like Edison had his own patron of J.P. Morgan, Tesla found patronage in a man by the name of George Westinghouse, and both of them were working to create alternating current power stations to power the United States of America. And this was in competition with Edison and J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan realized that Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse actually had the better product, and that Edison had just been too stubborn to admit it early on. So what's J.P. Morgan do? Well, J.P. Morgan was lucky enough that he was very, very, very wealthy. And George Westinghouse had been borrowing money to finance Tesla's projects. And J.P. Morgan ended up using this to his advantage. J.P. Morgan essentially approached George Westinghouse and agreed to relieve him of all of his debt in exchange for the patent for the alternating current. So J.P. Morgan takes over the projects of Tesla and Westinghouse and creates the company General Electric, a company that is still around today. Now, you've probably heard the name Tesla before because Tesla is remembered today by the Elon Musk car manufacturer. And Teslas today are, of course, electric cars. And that makes sense. And Tesla was a genius who envisioned a lot of innovations. He essentially predicted the cell phone 100 years before the cell phone was invented. And he saw endless opportunities, endless innovations that electricity could provide us. And so I'm sure, he could have envisioned an electric car too. The irony is that the Tesla car today is actually run by direct current, not alternating current. So, maybe it should have been named the Edison. So understanding J.P. Morgan as a financier, like I said before, can be rather abstract. And I personally have struggled to understand J.P. Morgan and what he actually did to make his money and what he actually did, what his role was as one of the great industrialists of the late 19th century. But here's how I've come to understand J.P. Morgan. He consolidated competing companies. He took two companies that were competing against each other and he got them to cooperate. He unified them. He formed a trust between the two companies. Now, again, we sort of get into this idea of competition, and we tend to think of competition in a capitalist society as being a very good thing. Once again, my silly coffee reference. You've got Starbucks, you've got Tim Hortons, they're competing against each other. They're both trying to produce the best product at the lowest price, and when that happens, the consumer wins. But there were times when competition was actually creating problems. When you'd have two companies competing with each other, and that competition may have ultimately destroyed both companies. And it was in those situations when Mr. Moneybags here, J.P. Morgan, would step in and work with those two companies to get them to cooperate in some way, shape, or form and save the companies. Now, that seems good, but think of also what he's doing. You take two companies that are competing with each other and you get them to cooperate, you get them to form a trust. Well, that also starts to sound like a monopoly. Two companies working together instead of competing with each other, especially when those companies are under the same trust. They're being controlled by the same group of people. And so what we find is once the 20th century rolls around, J.P. Morgan, just like John D. Rockefeller, will be charged for violating the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act. Okay, so let me give you an example of this. In the year 1879, there were two competing railroad companies. They were competing with each other to buy the same land to lay railroad tracks down between the same cities so that they could control travel and shipping in the same area. So you had one railroad company buying one plot of land here, the other one right next to it to stop that railroad company from laying down tracks there. And what was happening was gridlock. Both companies are putting money into this venture, and they're ultimately getting in each other's way. And ultimately, both companies could have gone bankrupt and collapsed. So here's a situation where competition is not working. And so here comes J.P. Morgan. Here's what J.P. Morgan does. In this very friendly, chummy way, J.P. Morgan invites the presidents of both companies to come and hang out with him on his yacht. J.P. Morgan's dad had just recently passed away, and J.P. Morgan had inherited even more money than he already had, and he decided to get himself a nice little present. So he bought a yacht and hired a crew to run the yacht for him. And he docked this yacht somewhere in Manhattan so that he could take leisurely trips up and down the Hudson River. And so he invited these two presidents to come and just spend an afternoon with him on his yacht. And so that's what these two presidents were expecting, that they would just sit down enjoy a drink. JP Morgan loved to smoke cigars, so JP Morgan would probably share a few cigars with them, and they would just have a nice leisurely afternoon. They had no idea what JP Morgan was getting them into. Once JP Morgan got them on the boat, he's got them trapped. He sets his crew out and tells his crew, be prepared to be out here indefinitely. We don't know when we're going to come back home. And he tells the presidents of these two railroad companies, we're not going back to dock until you guys agree to compromise. You guys form a pact. You're going to build this railroad together, not in competition with each other, but you're going to cooperate and build the railroad together. And you're going to figure out, at least when it comes to this one railroad line, how you're going to merge your companies. Or rather, merger is probably not the right word there. How your two companies are going to cooperate together to build this railroad. So this was a very, very, very long boat ride. But this was a trick that JP Morgan was going to do, not just this once. He's going to get competing business leaders together in the same room in the same time, and he's essentially going to force them to cooperate, to play nice with each other. This happened in the year 1789. The name of JP Morgan's yacht was the Corsair, so this became known as the Corsair Pact. And this is what JP Morgan was good at doing. He consolidates businesses. He takes two competing businesses in the same industry and he gets them to cooperate, to work together, usually in the form of a trust. And JP Morgan would help to run that trust. And one of the major industries that JP Morgan started taking over was the railroads. In the year 1893, there was a stock market crash. This is remembered as the Panic of 1893. One of the causes for the Panic of 1893 was the mismanagement of railroads. Some railroad lines had overextended themselves, thinking they would be able to make more money than they actually would, and they didn't, and there was a stock market crash. The president at the time was President Grover Cleveland. President Cleveland's plan for how to save the country from plummeting into a depression was for the United States federal government to bail out some of these larger companies. So Congress would agree to open up the coffers of the United States federal treasury and to bail out these companies. And the government would make this money back up by selling bonds to the American people. So a bond, one way to think of a bond, is an investment in the United States government. We'll hear about bonds a lot when we talk about World War I and World War II, in which our government sells war bonds to the American people. JP Morgan hears about this and goes to Washington, D.C., demands to speak to the President of the United States of America. JP Morgan is told by the officials at the White House, which actually wasn't called the White House yet, the Executive Mansion, that he was to go away, that the president didn't want to deal with JP Morgan. But JP Morgan refused to leave. He demanded to speak with the president. Now, the audacity of this. Here's JP Morgan who says, I can save the country. And I am just as powerful as the President of the United States, and probably even more. The country could be on the verge of an economic collapse. So, finally, Grover Cleveland relents, speaks to JP Morgan, who offers up this deal. JP Morgan will bail out the companies. He will give money to companies, like the railroad companies. But he will also be on a board of directors that will control these companies, and the companies will eventually have to pay this money back with interest. So JP Morgan saves the United States of America. He staves off a major economic depression, but he also profits from it personally. So people have two different ways of looking at JP Morgan. He's this selfless, hardworking savior of the United States, or he's a really smart, manipulative profiteer. Probably the most famous thing that JP Morgan did in his life involved Andrew Carnegie. In the year 1901, Andrew Carnegie was simply tired of running Carnegie Steel. He'd been doing this job for over 3 decades. And just like all of us, we get tired. It gets time to retire. JP Morgan saw an opportunity and he swooped down to help. In the year 1901, JP Morgan organized a meeting with one of Andrew Carnegie's business partners at Carnegie Steel, a man by the name of Charles Schwab. Morgan told Schwab that he was interested in buying Carnegie Steel and to find out what Andrew Carnegie's price was. So in a transaction that could have only happened in the 19th century, Andrew Carnegie wrote on a piece of paper $493 million. That's it. That's all he wrote on the paper. That paper was sent to JP Morgan. There was no haggling. He just agreed to it. That $493 million would be approximately $12 billion today. And Andrew Carnegie just received that in cash, which made Andrew Carnegie, for a brief period of time, the richest man in the world. But Rockefeller caught up with him. And of course, Andrew Carnegie did a good job of giving most of that money away. Carnegie Steel is now no longer Carnegie Steel. After it was bought by JP Morgan, it becomes U.S. Steel. And there are still steel plants outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Now, during times of economic recession, JP Morgan would take advantage of the low cost of things. So he would buy railroads, or rather he would buy railroad companies, and put them all under one trust. And in the year 1901, he placed a wide variety of these railroad companies under the trust of the Northern Securities Company. But the following year, JP Morgan was attacked by an office that he thought would never attack him, the President of the United States of America. Now, in 1902, the President of the United States was a man by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. We will learn much more about Theodore Roosevelt in a later lecture. Roosevelt, suffice it to say, did not trust big business. Roosevelt was a believer in competition. Roosevelt was fond of saying that the rich man must be held to the same accountability as the poor man. And Roosevelt was the first president, and really one of the only presidents, to use the power of his position to go after big business. And the method he used to go after big business was legal. Theodore Roosevelt summoned JP Morgan to Washington, D.C. to let him know that he was being sued for violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act and that the Northern Securities Company was going to get broken up. JP Morgan is being sued by the President of the United States, and he simply does not understand this. Less than 10 years before, he had bailed out the United States of America. Now he's being sued by a president. And JP Morgan says something which is actually fairly telling. He tells Theodore Roosevelt, I simply don't understand. If there's a problem, just send your man to talk to my man. So for me, this quote represents JP Morgan's way of thinking and a crossroads in American history. Prior to Theodore Roosevelt, during the entirety of the late 19th century, rich and powerful men like JP Morgan, like John D Rockefeller, like Andrew Carnegie, they worked very cooperatively with the United States federal government. Some people thought too cooperatively. There is plenty of evidence that those three men financed the campaign of the 1896 Republican candidate William McKinley, got him into office so that William McKinley would fight to stop legislation being passed that would hinder these businessmen from being able to make their millions. These major industrialists and politicians in power were working cooperatively together. When Theodore Roosevelt became president in September of 1901, his goal as president of the United States was to break off this type of relationship, that these wealthy industrialists were not going to be chummy with him, that he wanted to stop this type of relationship and hold these rich men accountable to the law, specifically the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. In the year 1902, the Northern Securities Company was broken up. 5 years later, in the year 1907, there was another panic on Wall Street. The stock market started to collapse. There was a run on banks, so many people were going to banks to pull out all their money, and those banks were starting to collapse. There was a significant fear that there might be a major economic depression. And the big question was, how is the United States federal government going to respond? Theodore Roosevelt was in his second term. 5 years after he had called JP Morgan to the carpet and sued him and broke up one of his trusts, Theodore Roosevelt now calls JP Morgan to the White House to have a very different type of discussion with him. Theodore Roosevelt must have been extraordinarily humbled to summon JP Morgan and to ask him for help. For the second time in his life, J.P. Morgan is going to have to save the economy of the United States of America and to stop a major economic depression. And to do so, he pulls an old trick. J.P. Morgan had recently built a library in downtown Manhattan. It sounds very Andrew Carnegie-like. He built this huge library for the people. Today, it's a museum. And in 1907, he invited the presidents of the major banks and the other companies, the other major companies at the time. He brought them all into his library to sit down, have a drink, smoke a cigar, and to talk about the current economic situation. Now, these guys were the super rich. These guys are probably not the guys who are going to get hit hardest by an economic depression. But he sat him down and he told him this: we have to save the United States of America. In order to do that, you, president of big, powerful banks, you guys who are in the business of taking over smaller banks, you company leaders who are in the business of taking over smaller companies, what I need you to do is to do something that is completely against common business sense. Instead of driving your competition out of business, I want you to give your competitors, these smaller banks and these smaller companies, money. I want you to inject your own money into these smaller businesses and these smaller banks. The United States government is going to help us out, but the US government is only offering $25 million. It's up to us. You figure out how much money you are willing to give. And then J.P. Morgan left the room and he locked the door, leaving these business leaders and these bank presidents to figure out how much money they were willing to give their smaller competitors to keep businesses and banks afloat in 1907. And they would talk and talk for hours about how much they were willing to give. And then one of J.P. Morgan's aides would come and find him and say, hey, they've come up with a number. J.P. Morgan would say, okay, what's the number? And J.P. Morgan's aide would say, oh, they've agreed to give this many millions of dollars. And J.P. Morgan would say, that's not enough. Go back and tell them they have to give more. And that back and forth went on and on all night long. J.P. Morgan literally ran them out of gas. They were exhausted. It was dawn when J.P. Morgan finally went into the room with his own contract for how much everybody should give, sat that piece of paper down and said, here's the place, here's the pen, sign it. And all of these bank presidents and all of these heads of business, all of these business leaders, all of these wealthy men, they gave millions of their own dollars to prop up the economy. J.P. Morgan did too, and the United States of America was once again saved from a major depression. J.P. Morgan did this twice in his lifetime. And that was also the last time this happened in American history, because this sort of thing just doesn't happen anymore. After that panic in 1907, within 10 years, there was a new government institution, the United States Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was developed in part to stabilize the banking system across the United States of America, to prevent such a collapse. So in the late 19th century, we saw the rise of these great, powerful industrialists. As the American economy and American industry boomed in the late 19th century, there were also scares. 1873, 1893, 1907. And it was in those cases that these extraordinarily powerful men, and especially J.P. Morgan, were asked to help save the United States of America. That doesn't happen anymore. Now we have a government institution to help protect us from an economic collapse. Within my own lifetime, the Federal Reserve has had to step in to help stop an economic collapse in the year 1989 and also in the year 2008. So thus ends our story of these three individuals. Were they good guys? Were they bad guys? What do you think? But before you can really make that judgment, we'll be taking a look in the next lecture at the lives of these individuals, the millions of American workers who worked on the railroads, who worked in the steel mills. We'll learn about what the late 19th century was like for them, because they have a completely different tale to tell, and they, as a group, will have an equally profound impact on American history. We'll learn about the workers of the late 19th century. But thus ends this recorded slideshow lecture, our first part of the story of the industrial era. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you'll learn something. Maybe you're even inspired to go out and become a great entrepreneur someday, or maybe even right now. Maybe you've got some leaves to rake up. All right, U.S. history students, have a great day. I'll see you in class.